Thank you. It's just a great joy for me to be with all of you today. And I want to start right off by telling you about one of the greatest human beings that has ever lived on this planet and one of the greatest leaders that will ever be, and that's my mother. So the story goes back to when I was about 7 years of age. And my father was an army doctor, and we lived in a small town in India. And we read in the newspaper, my younger brother was then 4 years old, and he's now the dean of medical education here in Harvard Medical School. So the four of us were told that our first prime minister, Mr. Nehru, was coming to our town. And for 3 weeks, there was only one conversation in our house. What was the color of the sari that my mother would wear for the occasion? And my father would tease her, of course, that there's going to be lots of people. He's not going to notice your sari. And she would say, you wait and see. So on the day that Mr. Nehru arrived, we were on the street at about 4 o'clock in the morning. My father, with his World War II Army medals in his uniform, my little brother in his shorts, my mother in a beautiful pink sari. And by about 7 o'clock, there were millions of people on the street. Now, in India, when I say millions, it is millions, okay? It's not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, millions. People on treetops, people hanging on window ledges, people on each other's shoulders, rambunctious, rowdy, boisterous. And 5 hours later, Mr. Nehru's motorcade turned the corner before our house, and he was standing in the Jeep with a white, what we now call a Nehru jacket, a rose in his pocket, a motorcycle in the front, a motorcycle in the back, and very slowly it turned the corner, came by us, and as it went by us, Mr. Nehru turned, he looked at my mother, he took his rose out and he threw it at her. And the crowd gasped, except for my mother, who stepped forward like a queen and picked up the rose and looked at my father and said, Daddy, what did I tell you? At that moment, age 6 years, I knew my mother was the leader in our house, even though my father was wearing the army uniform and the medals. So we went home, and she emptied a room, and in the middle of the room, she placed a table, somewhat like these tables here. In the middle of the table, a vase and the rose. And for the next 3 weeks, people came to our house to look at the rose. They would step into the house in awe. They would take off their shoes before they entered the room, and then they would go in and look at and stare at the rose. After 3 weeks, the rose started to fade, and my mother had a party. She invited all the people that she was bonded to, and at the end of the party, everybody got a faded rose petal. And you should have seen how they took it. It was like a jewel, a diamond, an heirloom. So I asked my mother, I said, what was so special about those rose petals? And she said something that I never forgot, influenced my life. She said, those rose petals represented the soul of India. So this is a very extraordinary statement, the soul of India. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, when we look at those rose petals, we think of not only Mr. Nehru, but Mahatma Gandhi, who brought the downfall of the British Empire without violence. And when we think of that, we think of the yearnings, the longings, the dreams, the aspirations of a collective consciousness. And you have to be that soul as you grow up. You have to be the embodiment of a collective dream. I tell you this story today because your conference here is about imagination, and the human imagination has gone through eons of evolution. We started as hunter-gatherers, and our imagination was just about hunting and gathering. We moved to the age of agriculture, where it was about feeding and making sure that we survived beyond the animal hunt. We went to the age of industry, where the sources of wealth and affluence in countries became natural resources like oil, machines, and minerals, and there's still much of our global economy. But from the age of industry, we moved to the information age, and now the source of wealth is shifting, and economies are shifting to digital technologies, because the silicon chip, which is the new imagination of our collective consciousness, is influencing our global identity. The age of information, with social networks and with things like, I just heard, Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, they're creating a new identity for us as we go beyond our narrow boundaries, whether they're sexual identities, ethnic, racial, global identities are emerging. What's happening in Syria, what's happening in Egypt, what's happening in Tunisia, Libya, India, China, it's all becoming part of our understanding that our survival depends on a new identity. From the age of information, our imagination is going to go to the age of knowledge, where a new kind of knowledge is needed to really improve the conditions of our world, where we live in a world where 50% of the world lives in poverty. 20% of the world lives on less than $5 a day, where there are all kinds of social injustice. Injustice against women, injustice against children, injustice against minorities, injustice against people of different sexual identity. We live in a world that is rapidly depleting its resources, a world that is rapidly becoming unsustainable, a world where we use weapons of mechanized death to solve simple problems, a world where there is no creativity and imagination. So the world that we have created right now through information technology needs to evolve to a knowledge-based society, and ultimately into what I can only think of a wisdom-based society. So Jonas Salk, who was a great scientist and a pioneer, towards the end of his life was saying that we need a wisdom-based culture, not a knowledge-based culture, a wisdom-based civilization which will bring about a more peaceful, just, sustainable, and healthy world. And this is where I really think very strongly, where 50% of the world's population, which is women, are going to have to take the new role of leadership. And I'm not saying this because I'm here in a women's conference. I'm saying this because this has to be, it has to be the next stage of human evolution. The masculine energies brought us here. They made us survive in the age of the hunter-gatherer, in the age of industry. But today, as we move from information to knowledge to wisdom, because wisdom is that knowledge which nurtures and brings about peace and harmony and social justice and sustainability and equality and a new imagination, we need your help. And I say this with all humility. So as I grew up in a culture which has lots of contradictions, lots of paradox, in many ways lots of ambiguity, but the culture was also based on an imagination that looked at the archetypal feminine. And this is what I want to do with the remaining 10 minutes that I have. First of all, it was mentioned earlier that I speak of the soul of leadership. And for me, a great leader is the symbolic soul of a collective imagination that becomes an agent for change, transformation, and evolution. And for this, I have, in my own life, created an acronym. The acronym is LEADERS, L-E-A-D-E-R-S. L stands for look and listen deeply to the collective conversation and the collective need. Look and listen with your eyes, with your heart, with your mind, with your soul. With that looking and listening, ask yourself, what kind of world do I want to live in? And how am I going to participate in the creation of that world? To have that clarity of vision. E stands for emotional bonding, to be in touch with our emotions, to be in touch with our vulnerability, as was expressed by the previous speaker, to be in touch with our fears, but to understand that there's a gift in that emotional vulnerability. There's a gift in understanding our emotions, in understanding the emotions of the other, and that we have the capacity to nurture emotional bonds as never before, to understand not only our own emotions, but to practice compassion and empathy from a place of authenticity. A stands for awareness. What are we observing? What are we feeling? What is the collective need, and how can we fulfill that collective need? D stands for doing, daring to dream and doing, creating action plans, smart goals, stretching beyond where we can reach, making everything measurable, having a collective agreement on where we want to go, keeping a record of our progress, and creating time limits in our imagination. E, the next E, stands for empowerment, to be immune to criticism and yet responsive to feedback, to feel that we are beneath no one, that our fears and our vulnerabilities are actually our greatest strengths. True empowerment, which comes from, again, authenticity. R stands for responsibility, taking responsibility, taking initiative, being a role model, being responsive to feedback, taking risks, and taking responsibility for our health and well-being, our physical health, our emotional health, our spiritual health, and taking also responsibility for getting good rest, good sleep, as you will hear from Ariana Huffington later, good rest, good sleep, enjoying healthy relationships, and taking time to nurture our physical well-being through exercise and through stress management and through meditation. And finally, S stands for synchronicity. Synchronicity is the coming together of unusual and almost impossible conspiracies of coincidences, what people have called good luck. And that is something that we can learn to harness, which I learned from my mother. She said, if you have intention, if you have a story, and if that story is going to be useful to other people, then you can depend on the forces of nature to support you. So that's been my formula for leadership. But there was something more that I learned as I was growing up and in my forays into the world of biology and evolution. And I want to share this with you in the last 5 minutes that I have. And it's the process of collective transformation. And the metaphor I want to use today with you is the transformation of a caterpillar into a butterfly. Because, as has been so poetically said, just when the caterpillar thought the world was coming to an end, it turned into a butterfly. And today is the time where we need to do this. We need to take the next evolutionary leap in our collective imagination. So here's how it goes. You know, when a caterpillar turns into a voracious eater, when it eats, consumes more than it can metabolize, its body begins to decay. But within the body of the caterpillar, there are a few cells that scientists today refer to as the imaginal cells. And these imaginal cells are different in their behavior. They are incubating and they start to connect with each other. The immune cells of the caterpillar's body, they attack the imaginal cells, but they remain immune to the onslaught of this attack. They start imagining, connecting, creating new networks, and one day the connectivity of the imaginal cells reaches what is called a tipping point, a critical mass, and they start to use the dying, decaying body of the caterpillar as their nutritive soup. It becomes actually the culture medium in which they grow. And one day, as I said, when it reaches a critical mass, then a new gene, which has always been there, which is lying dormant in the body, it wakes up and it has the entire mechanics for the creation of a new creature. And a butterfly emerges and the nutritive soup of the dying caterpillar has been consumed. And I hope you see the analogy here. My mother used to say that the next phase of our collective transformation, of our collective imagination, is going to be the awakening of the goddess within us, of the archetypal feminine within us. And I grew up with these goddesses as part of my psyche, of my being. So in India we have the three goddesses: the goddess of wisdom, Saraswati, the goddess of abundance, Lakshmi, and the goddess of destruction, of ignorance, Durga. Saraswati creates through her knowledge and wisdom. Lakshmi brings abundance into our life if we seek that wisdom, and Durga destroys the ignorance that impedes us. As I grew up, she introduced me to the archetypal goddesses of Western civilization. The great archetypal energies: Demeter, the mother energy, the nurturer; Hera, the goddess of power; Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and sexuality and power as well; Artemis, the goddess that gets us in touch with the archetypal energies and elements and forces of nature; Persephone, the goddess that understands the subconscious world where our hidden motivations lie in the mythical world; Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And she said, if you incarnate these in your own being, then the collective soul will trigger the new imagination that we need to create a culture of peace, harmony, laughter, love, and a civilization that we are ready for at the moment that will bring about not only sustainability but social justice, economic justice, and a civilization where we go beyond our narrow boundaries and become citizens of this planet and ultimately of the cosmos. And that the new social networks that are emerging, whether it's Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and all the others, are really the new neural networks for our collective mind. And with those, we can harness collectively the intelligence, the creativity, and the imagination to give birth, literally give birth, to a new world and a new civilization. The time is now, because we are in a moment of crisis. We are in a moment where the caterpillar's body is decaying, and in a moment where a new imagination needs to be born. I hope you will go within and connect with each other with only one question. What kind of world do I want to live in? What kind of world do I want my children and my grandchildren to grow up in? And what am I going to do about it? If you ask the question, if you live the question, then life will move you into the answers. And that is my only plea with you. We need your help right now to create a wisdom-based civilization. Thank you.